Economics and the outgoing president of the International Association for Feminist Economics. I'm also one of the founding members of Women for Women's Human Rights, which is the organizer of today's parallel event. WWHR, for those of you who may not be so familiar with it, is an autonomous feminist organization based in Turkey, but working across local, national, regional, and international levels for advocacy of gender equality. It's a long-standing organization. It was founded in 1993, and recently we celebrated our 30th anniversary. And I believe that as long as it has been around, it has participated in the UN Commission on the Status of Women in a variety of roles, definitely as part of civil society delegations, but also there were good times when some of our members also were part of the official national delegation to the CSW, or organizing parallel events as part of the civil society forum, as we are doing today. So the title, the theme of the parallel event today tries to relate to the theme of this year's CSW, and as a reminder, which for this year was entitled Accelerating the Achievement of Gender Equality and the Empowerment of All Women and Girls by Addressing Poverty and Strengthening Institutional and Financing with a Gender Perspective. So with respect to the theme which of this event, we tried to bring out some components of the current framework within which we try to address poverty and issues around financing. And one of those determining dimensions, unfortunately, is an emerging what we call gender backlash, an attack on rights. And part of the objectives of today's event is look at the relationship, the interactions between this gender backlash and the attacks on rights and the gender dimensions of poverty. And of course, as civil society actors, we are all engaged in feminist relief strategies. And part of what we will be looking at today will basically pertain to funding for feminist organizations in this struggle. So we were supposed to have 4 speakers for today's event, but unfortunately, Hazel Bringy, one of our speakers from International Women's Rights Action Watch, Asia Pacific, she will not be able to participate as she fell ill yesterday. She informed us yesterday, so we wish her well. But we have our other 3 distinguished speakers with very interesting and cutting-edge work relating to the theme of this event. We will start with, as the first speaker, with Pınar Uyan Semerci. Pınar is the Dean of the Faculty of Social Sciences and Humanities at Bilgi University and also the Director for the Center for Migration Research at Istanbul Bilgi University. Her research interests lie at the crossroads between political philosophy, social policy, and methodology. She focuses on topics relating to justice, capability approach, citizenship, poverty, migration, collective identity formation, othering, polarization, and well-being of vulnerable groups. Pınar has coordinated numerous research projects and published mainly on the capability approach, othering, polarization, migrants, seasonal agricultural workers, child labor, and child well-being in Turkey. Pınar's presentation is going to be on needs, rights, and capabilities, discussing gender equality in times of polycrisis. She's the first speaker because she will be setting the framework for the ensuing presentations and discussion. Pınar, the floor is yours, and you have about 16 minutes.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction and also give me the opportunity to have this discussion with you. I hope we will have enough time for discussing together. I will try to share my screen. Actually, it's disabled. So if you can also share, it's okay.
It should be okay right now, but
Okay, let me just check now. I think it's there.
Yes, we can see
Okay.
it.
Okay.
If you can put it
Yes.
on full,
All right.
yes, that
Okay.
is perfect now. Thank you.
Actually, with this limited time, what I will try to do is to set sort of the general background and most of the maybe it's not just recent times, but currently what we are living in times of polycrisis, or what we name as uncertainties, times of uncertainties, overlapping crisis, intersecting crisis, whatever we name it. The things that we have been facing after COVID-19 especially, I just want to start with this, because I think it's very timely to question this backlash and what we are living and the difficulties of talking about rights, human rights, women rights, but they're very connected to what we are in. And which is actually not limited to one country context, but a global phenomena. And the problems that we are facing actually requires much more international, global cooperation rather than sort of the existing political systems we have. So I will just very basically go over what I mean, what is discussed in general in the global sort of dimension about this polycrisis. Climate, as you all know, maybe one of the most important one, because it is a very existential one for the earth and also all the beings that exist on it. But this is also not just one dimension in terms of the climate affecting the nature and the existential problems of the world, but actually it also leads to many different conflicts and wars, and also migration. So most of the time, the most important issue with polycrisis argument is that we have crisis situations which lead to one another, and it's sometimes very hard to differentiate, to crystallize what had an effect on the other. So when I talk about polycrisis, climate, wars, conflicts, social and political polarization, democracy, political backlash, democratic backlash, pandemics, different versions, not only COVID-19, energy crisis, economic crisis, and also, unfortunately, disasters, which usually named as natural, but we all know that some of them are natural, but some of them are due to the climate change. And though it's named as a natural disaster, it's actually more Anthropocene, human-made, let's say, disasters. Or a disaster happens and then it had an enormous effect due to the conditions human sort of contribute, like lack of control or sort of corruption, or various ways of human contribution to the effects, which are multiplied the results for human survival or natural survival. So these are namely sort of general well-known crises that we are trying to understand, but at the same time, we are living in an age of change. Digital transformation, artificial intelligence, the whole discussion about post-truth, we are actually losing facts. What is true is always a question, but the what we call infodemic, similar to pandemic, false information, fake information, just rapidly going around the world compared to, let's say, it's the correct one. So what we are living in, existing condition with all these polycrises, but at the same time, a pandemic on information disorders. And all these create a big problem for all of us, because we started to live in different worlds and had access to information through our echo chambers. And at the same time, we have all these populist political systems. So what is sort of, to wrap up quickly, we have simultaneously happening crises that intersects and triggers each other. So this is a very sort of, let's say, which we call as chronotimes, what we experience in today's world. And this challenges human security, but actually it challenges further all of the vulnerable groups, and especially intersectionally vulnerable groups. Well, when we talk about poverty, women, I have been, since my PhD, I have been working on the most disadvantaged groups of the society, seasonal agriculture workers, migrants, refugees, working sort of all these sort of informal economy, those women and those children that are working. And when we look at all these things that are happening at the same time, even only looking at the pandemic during the COVID-19, we know that all these challenges had an enormous effect on the well-being of the most vulnerable. So this crisis, this polycrisis, create big problems, and it leads to further migration and transborder crisis, and of course, failure or limitation of welfare regimes of individual countries and the whole citizenship framework. And again, big discussion, which I hope we will have more time to do, the failure of also institutions, families, schools, social political institutions, transnational, international, global institutional system. And all these sort of acting together, sort of learning about all these, and even maybe taking certain steps to sort of restore or reformulate the existing problems, needs a common ground on understanding what is the problem. And actually, this is under threat because all these discussions leads to further fear, and also with the economic, political crisis that we are in, people are much more close their sort of understanding, and rather than empathy, fear, uncertainty, these are the main, let's say, emotions that had widely spread all around the world and create further othering. So I think this is crucial that we understand in the existing conditions we have this sort of radical right movements, questioning the rights of women, sort of anti, let's say LGBTI, all these movements that we are seeing all around the world are taking a space or gaining further, let's say, move with the existing uncertainties and the fear that is developed. So the second thing that I would like to share with you and hope that it will contribute to debate is the discussion needs, rights, and capabilities. In line with these discussions that we have with the polycrisis, actually, we have been working on the right framework for a very long time. Of course, the citizenship framework has been challenged, but still, civil, political, socio-economic rights have been important ways to create equality within the citizenship framework. The first thing maybe we need to underline, of course, always there have been limitations on this universality claim of citizenship, even within a country context, that rights exist, but not everybody has the same access possibility or enjoy the rights in the same way, namely, and of course, for the audience, I don't need to repeat, but mostly like the experience of men and women, totally different in this universality claims of citizenship. But still, I mean, this is an important way of moving from needs to rights. Human rights, a further, much more universal framework that we all try to work in. But what I'm trying to underline is that although there have been problems with the rights always sort of providing equality, still this framework had been very important to create an equal worldview. Then, of course, what we formulate with poverty is seeing poverty as a violation of human rights. So not only limitations of citizenship, but as a universal claim that when we observe poverty, when we see poverty, it's also a violation of human rights. Now, a second thing that I would like to take this framework is that, of course, how do we decide on rights. What is a right? Why we claim right? And I'm not going to get into that with the time limitation, but I think it's also crucial to under that from needs to rights, there's an important sort of step, and that politics of need interpretation. So what we see as an important need also differs from the society to society, one gender to another. So all these discussions are, of course, based itself on the existing understanding of needs towards rights. And one important dimension in this is, of course, to have a further like equal society. Deciding on the boundaries, of course, is important, but the most important, again, contribution of Nancy Fraser, and I guess it's also important with our discussion today, is that we try to redistribute the income or whatever goods we have, but it also needs to be based on recognition of the differences, and also it needs to be based on participation of different diverse groups. Why this is important? Because actually, when we talk about rights, with the existing limitations of rights, we still know that rights do not turn into capabilities equally. So when we talk about human rights or poverty as violation of human rights, this, of course, does not give us the possibility to understand in detail or to picture what's going on in the field. So what I would suggest is that within the existing conditions of the world right now, which is very related to one another, the poly-crisis, democratic backlash, backlash in the rights of women, and all these discussions, we need to provide a better way of showing the limitations, especially for the most disadvantaged, most vulnerable groups. And there I would suggest capability framework as an important step to reflect the inequalities that we have been facing. And again, going back to the framework, redistribution, recognition, and participation parity, I would actually argue that in order to sort of reflect what's going on in the field, for these different disadvantaged, poor, mostly, let's say, most disadvantaged group or vulnerable groups, we need to provide this question of their capability sets, comparison of what they can actually exercise as a right. So what I will suggest, I mean, I know the limitation of time, so is it like 3 minutes or so?
Yes, about 3 minutes.
Okay, so what I will try to say in this 3 minutes is that if we try to, with the existing limitations of the whole poly-crisis, infodemics, and whatever we have been facing right now, if we try to formulate poverty, or let's say the most disadvantaged groups, political, social, economic conditions, particularly for women, and please keep in mind that different versions of the disadvantages exist. So when we're talking about disadvantage, it usually intersectional vulnerabilities that I'm trying to get at, like a migrant woman, a refugee woman with children or with disability. When you think about all these sort of vulnerabilities exist at the same time, I would suggest that looking at the lens of capability and comparing their position in terms of different groups, even within the same family, for example, for a very, let's say, disadvantaged groups, when we look at through the lens of capabilities, ethical individualism, we will definitely provide a better way of showing the problems or inequalities in terms of capabilities. And the final point that I would like to say is that in the literature, most of the time, we have seen, especially for poly-crisis, the term that comes from psychology discipline, resilience. And it's a very hard sort of term it is powerful, definitely, of course, and we try to develop more resilient individuals or resilient women, but at the same time, it is putting the focus, let's say, focus on individuals or women's ability or children's ability or child's ability to survive, or like falling and then standing up. So this is sort of the resilience. But we also, I guess, should try to develop more general understanding, like societal resilience, as also written in the call, for this, let's say, for the future perspective, not only putting emphasis on individuals' ability or women's ability, but more the conditions of how to make that woman or that child or a girl, a small female child, to survive, to stand up, how to provide a safety net so that there will be a kind of way to stand up after that fall. Because these crises create continuous risk, higher risk. So that's also the theme, that overlapping crises will lead to further problems for the lives of those most vulnerable groups. And so what should be the ways to provide a safety net so that both societal and political, we will provide a possibility for them to stand up. So let me stop there, and I hope we will have a more time of discussion.
Thank you, Pınar, for this very interesting framework presentation, and also for keeping to time. It ended right on the spot. So there were many interesting points coming out of this presentation, but I would like to highlight 3 takeaways on my part. The first one is the point that you made, Pınar, about the fact that rights, even when they are there, do not necessarily translate automatically into capabilities. The second one was the interconnectedness of the polycrises and the feedback mechanisms between these different crises. And the third one, which I think is a very important point that you made, is the importance of addressing the issue of resilience, not at the individual level, but at the macro and structural level, addressing the structural causes and building up macro structural systems that help individual resilience. Thank you for this presentation. Okay, our second speaker is Süheyla Nazneen. Süheyla is a senior fellow based in the governance cluster at the Institute of Development Studies in the UK. She leads the institute's work on gender, politics, and governance, and her research focuses on feminist movements and backlash, gendered policy processes, violence against women, and women's empowerment, particularly in the context of South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. Süheyla has published widely on these issues, including World Development, Development Policy Review, Contemporary South Asia, Studies in Family Planning, and other journals. She currently leads the Stream on Voice and Activism Against Backlash for the Countering Backlash Research Consortium. And Süheyla is the editor of Negotiating Gender Equity in the Global South and Voicing Demands, Feminist Activism in Transitional Contexts. Welcome, Süheyla, as our one speaker based outside of Turkey. Süheyla will present on gendered poverty and the interconnections to anti-rights movements. What do we know and what can we do about it? Süheyla, the floor is yours.
Thank you, İpek, and thank you for asking me to be a part of this very interesting panel. Let me try to share my screen. Can you guys see it?
Yes, we can. Yeah.
Let's go back. I'm trying to make it. Okay.
Yes.
All right, we are set. Of course, as you can see from the title, the presentation covers a big canvas, but I mean, let's see how far we get in terms of chipping down to the bare bones of what is actually happening. And I'm very grateful to Pınar for setting out the global context and sort of the polycrisis that we are facing and how that affects women in specific ways, but also the intersectional dimensions and discussions on rights. So this is what my presentation will focus on. What I'm trying to do is explore the connections between populist and authoritarian regimes, because not all populist regimes are authoritarian, although they have authoritarian tendencies, with the connection that we see in the rise globally of anti-gender, anti-rights movements, and what are the implications of these on addressing gendered poverty and economic the possible implications of economic disempowerment of women or our advancement in that agenda or the gains being eroded. Then what I'll do is I'll also offer some reflections on the ways to challenge what we are facing. Basically, my key takeaway message is gendered poverty is a political issue because it is a choice made by power holders, be that within family or community or at the national level, policymakers, or at the global level. It's a political choice not to take action in specific ways. And we know a lot of the solutions in terms of technical solutions to how this can be addressed. And if we want to push the agenda, it requires a political solution, not just technical solutions of how things could be done, but it's also about pushing that agenda. Having said that, let me lay out the global context a little bit in terms of both economic and political context and the challenges and the opportunities that it contains from a political lens. So we know that barriers, and we have heard from Pınar that the impact of COVID-19, the pandemic, and the cost of living crisis that we are facing, so a polycrisis, it has a deep gendered impact. Whether that impact is in labor markets on specific groups of workers and professions that women are in, whether that is about health or nutritional impact that we are seeing with the rise in food insecurity and disruption of supply chains, whether that's impact on climate crisis, then impacting a rise in gender-based violence, right? But also in our political context, what we are seeing in many countries is a political polarization, whether you see that in the US or whether that you see it in the UK or in other countries, my own country, Bangladesh. But what it is leading to is an erosion of the social pacts that already existed. So for example, right now I'm based in the UK, the discussions around NHS, which is a basic right to get healthcare treatment, irrespective of your class, gender, creed, that is being eroded in terms of the ability of the NHS to cater to particular services, right? We also see a rise in ethno-nationalist rhetoric, which Pınar referred to, but then that affects particular groups of people, particularly migrants, in the way they're being vilified and portrayed, or refugees. So particular groups become more vulnerable. If you don't belong to the majority community, you experience more intersectional disadvantages. So the world is fragile in a sense, and this is a barrier in the way we try to promote rights-based claims and economic citizenship when it comes to addressing gendered poverty. But there are also opportunities. What are the opportunities? One is, of course, that the moment of polycrisis, of course, it means that there is an urgency in the way that we need to act. The other bit is there is a realization that people's resources are depleted, whether that's individual assets and savings or whether depletion in terms of women's time poverty. It's basically, we can see a rise in transitional poverty, which has a gendered impact. And the current CSW discussion, we can see that there is a lot of concern around how do we address this depletion. So both moments, there are barriers and there are opportunities. Given that this is a global context, that's what it looks like. Let's also think through how are these connected to anti-rights and anti-gender backlash that we sort of see, which is a condition that we are trying to tackle in not just in the policy world, but also in the populist discourse when you talk about rights, and how does that connect to gendered poverty? So backlash actors are diverse. They can be socially conservative forces, they can be faith-based institutions, they can be political parties with certain kind of religious political agenda, they could be populist leaders. So there's not one set of actors. But what these actors do is there is a similarity in the way they approach women's rights and gender equality. One is, of course, what we are seeing very alarmingly, and I can talk about India, but I can also talk about other contexts, is that there's a the rhetoric is about retraditionalizing women's roles. There's a push towards promoting this ideal traditional family, which never existed, an emphasis on women as nation builders, women as mothers, and then certain conditionalities. You want conditional cash transfers? Okay, you have to be good mothers to look after children, not as you're a vulnerable citizen and you have a right to social protection, right? There's also the other kind of rhetoric that we are seeing. So everyone's talking about women's empowerment in terms of exploiting women's labor. So it's empowerment light. Yes, it's responsibilizing the individual, which Pınar touched upon when she talked about resilience. So it's the woman's job, it's the gender diverse group's job, it's the vulnerable poor's job to ensure they dig out of poverty. But it's not necessarily, it's individual responsibilizing. It's not about strengthening collective ability to bargain in the market, which is a key cornerstone of economic empowerment. It's also, you see states trying to ride on women's ability to provide unpaid care, because it's rolling back state services and provisions that are there to provide support to women. What we also see in the populist regimes who are drivers of anti-gender, of gender backlash, is there particular schemes that are being now rolled out in countries which are facing elections, and these schemes are personalized. So, for example, in India, lots of popular schemes are named after the Prime Minister Narendra Modi, like, for example, supplying gas cylinders to poor women. This is targeted to win votes, but it also ties women to traditional roles. Why do women need gas cylinders? Because they do most of the cooking, right? It's not about like, can we share the duties or can we reduce the burden of women in terms of doing all those chores? What we also see globally is an undermining of labor rights and security that you find from stable, formal employment and the larger structural change agenda that we want to talk about around rights. Having said that, and Pınar touched upon this, because international norms and standards and institutions and agreements are being undermined, that has an impact on what do you appeal to and how do you appeal if these standards and norms are violated, which touches on, of course, issues around economic justice. And this undermining happens by actors that are driving backlash. Having said that, not all is doom and gloom, and it depends on which context you're in the kinds of strategies you want to push to ensure that your rights are protected, or how do you promote gender equality. One is, of course, to remember as we talk about the global picture that nationally things may look different. Each country is in a different position in terms of how they're recovering from the poly crisis, that is, if they're recovering at all. So where Bangladesh is not necessarily where you'd see, let's say, Pakistan. Recovery is different from poly crisis. And this is where the national context and factors become important. One is, of course, how states decide to respond to gendered poverty, including the ruling elite, depends on what's the history of the compact that exists between the states and citizens of that country with respect to anti-poverty agenda, welfare, rights, and other issues. In some countries, these are stronger. In other countries, these are weaker. The second is, of course, there is sectoral politics, and each sector and each policy has a particular legacy in each specific country. So how social protection schemes came about and what were the initial discussions around that in Turkey is very different than what it is in Bangladesh, right? The other bit is what kind of pressure is there on the government to perform, even if it is a populist government or authoritarian government. Having said that, there are certain political openings this year to push the anti-poverty agenda and gender equality agenda in terms as it is tied to that. One is, of course, elections are happening this year. In some countries, these elections will be fiercely competitive, and there will be a real competition in terms of trying to win votes. So, for example, Taiwan's election is very different from what happened in Bangladesh, where major opposition parties boycotted the election, right? So whether poverty gets debated and opportunities here will vary. And this is where we need to think through, is our context something where poverty agenda needs to be highlighted, and gender equality within that? Is there room for that? The second bit is, if you have electoral autocracies, and in many countries you have elections, but they don't mean much, the government may be anxious to perform, to show that we have reduced poverty, we have increased well-being of women, because they want to stay in power. If the condition is like that, then getting the government to account for that is one way of pushing the agenda. But again, it depends on what kind of political context you're in and where the opportunities are. Having said that, I will also talk about how do we work politically within the existing systems that we have. Because as I said, the gendered poverty agenda is political. One is, of course, the first point is to understand, what is my state's capacity like to address gendered poverty? Each state is different. Some states may have technical capacity. What it means is to do a gendered assessment, whether that's of budgets, whether that's how you roll out social protection schemes, whether that is about labor market conditions. All of those are important. Second is the fiscal capacity. Does my state have money actually for the programs that or policies we are recommending? Third is organizational capacity. So is the state coordinated? What capacity is there? And the last bit, and very important bit, is the state committed? Is there political will? And in a lot of the countries, it's a lip service, and actual political will is missing. The other bit, when we assess state capacity to address gendered poverty, is to think through how this has been historically approached. In many countries, the discussion on anti-poverty, and when we talk about gender equality, gets limited to social policies like social protection or labor market interventions. There are very few times that we touch on macroeconomic policies, and we know that macroeconomic stability is quite important, and these policies have an impact in the way it affects gendered poverty. So fiscal policies having a share of the macroeconomic pie is, of course, vital. And this is where, when we talk about gender mainstreaming, in many countries it has worked, in other countries it hasn't. We also know that a lot of the time we responsibilize gender ministries or women's ministries to take care of the issue. But these are weaker ministries in terms of staff, in terms of resources, compared to finance ministries, and finance ministries have a different logic. What that means is, of course, that we need to be politically savvy, and I'm coming to that in terms of how to do that. But it is also an issue about coordinating better. Some of our states are federal states. Some states have more, central governments have more control, right? So how do you coordinate better at different levels so policies filter down? And that is a critical challenge. Having said that, there are two things that become quite important when we face these challenges. One is, of course, to think through where are the critical actors that are willing to champion the gender agenda. Second bit is, of course, to think through what are the accountability mechanisms that exist. Now, existing evidence, for example, during COVID-19 shows that in some instances, subnational governments had better capacity and were more willing to address gendered poverty or take up care agenda, which national governments were not, for example, in Brazil. So if the opportunity is there, you go there. The other bit is to think through who are your champions in other ministries apart from gender ministry, in the agricultural ministry, in the labor ministry. How do you join up the dots? How do you create the space for them to connect? The third bit is, a lot of the time our advocacy focuses on getting on the parliament and talking to the MPs, but the power may lie inside the cabinet. So who's your champion in the cabinet? And the last bit is, of course, to track and monitor who's having an oversight on how the government is spending money, for example, gender budgets. How do you track implementation and gender analysis of specific programs? Those getting data on that becomes very important. So as I talk about data, and this is my last slide, which is about how do us as feminist actors then think, what are the issues we prioritize and what do we think through. One is, of course, Pınar already touched upon it, is having an intersectional lens and understanding intersectional needs and disadvantages, both in terms of collecting evidence, but also in terms of pushing the groups that are supposed to ensure accountability inside the state, taking that up. The third thing that's very important, and many states are doing that, is rolling out the digital. And we know why they want to roll out the digital. A lot of the states, if it's an authoritarian state, want to surveil the citizens. This is where you need to counter that while protecting rights, but at the same time, think through how can the digital be used to engage citizens, to raise grievances, but also for monitoring better service provision. That becomes a key area to unpack and a key area to debate. What is also important as we think about movement building is going beyond feminist movements and causes and connecting up with other social movements. For example, people who work on tax justice, people who work on climate justice, which then takes us to the issue of how do we represent gender issues and what are the alternative forums for doing that? Are there citizens forums at the local level, participatory budget mechanisms, community scorecarding? These are all social accountability mechanisms that some government have set up. Let's use those forums. And what is also important is to think through how we connect up to international norms and connect to the international and regional levels, who are our friends and allies there, who can take up the cause and the vision that we promote. And İpek, I know you can talk a lot about this in terms of visions of a care-centered economy, but also a society that's based on care, because providing that alternative narrative to what exists is very, very important. So I'll end my presentation there, and these are some of the resources that I've used. And thank you so much for asking me to speak here.
Thank you, Süheyla, for this very rich content. There's so many interesting issues coming out of it, but again, in the way of maybe highlighting some of the main takeaways, gendered poverty is a political issue. That's a great slogan. You said that we knew the technical solutions, although I would like to put a question mark on it because there's a menu of technical solutions, and which ones are the feminist strategies is another area of discussion, but that it's a matter of commitment, political and social commitment to making the big push against gendered poverty. You also talked about the multiplicity of gender backlash actors, but at the same time with the common connecting aspects of their discourses and their strategies. And opened up this question of what we mean by empowerment. That there's a consensus on the need for women's empowerment, but what is meant by it can differ. And when you talk about empowerment as increased burden, that also links to an important issue that you mentioned on how gendered poverty is not only income poverty, but also time poverty. And finally, you highlighted the distinct futures of national contexts in recovery from the poly crisis, how the capabilities and opportunities differ across national contexts, and how we need to build our feminist strategies informed by this national context. And I think the role of the digital revolution is definitely an important issue that we as the feminist movement need to explore further. So our final speaker is Pınar Ensari. Pınar Ensari is a PhD candidate in sociology at Koç University in Turkey. She is also a co-founder of Feminist Fund, a local initiative launched in early 2023 to support feminist and queer activist groups and organizations in Turkey. Pınar obtained BA degrees in philosophy and political science and international relations from Bosphorus University and an MA degree in cultural studies from Sabancı University. Prior to her PhD studies, she worked as a project coordinator in several civil society organizations, focusing on hate speech, human rights, philanthropy, and strengthening the capacity of civil society. During her PhD, Pınar also engaged in extensive research on the migration development nexus, borders and borderlands, and gender inequalities exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic. Pınar has also co-authored expert reports and policy recommendations on these topics, including the Resistor project's fact sheet. Welcome, Pınar. The floor
Thank
is
you.
yours.
Hello, everyone. Do you hear me?
Yes, we can. You don't have a visual presentation, right?
Yes, I don't have.
Yes.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for making time to listen to us today. I also would like to express my sincere thanks to the organizers of this panel for providing this opportunity to engage in this vital
Gratitude
conversation.
ablacığım, gratitude.
As we gather here today to discuss the critical issues surrounding attacks on rights, gender dimensions of poverty, and feminist relief strategies, I would like to address you on a topic that lies at the heart of these challenges: the vital role of feminist organizations, initiatives, and movements in times of crises, and the urgent need for sustainable, participatory, and flexible funding to support these efforts, not only to respond to the needs of the women and LGBTQI individuals, but also to foster structural change in collaboration with grassroots communities. I see a message here. Okay. With multiple and intersecting crises impacting the world, such as poverty, health, war, state violence, climate crisis, food security, earthquakes, gender-based violence, to name a few, more and more people, particularly women and LGBTQI individuals, are being pushed harder into poverty. It has been shown that groups at various intersections of inequality, particularly gender, class, age, race, ethnicity, nationality, and sexuality, were made even more vulnerable and pushed into deep poverty during the crises. Civil society organizations, particularly feminist organizations, initiatives, and activists, have emerged as crucial actors in responding to interconnected crises, particularly meeting the urgent needs on the ground and standing in solidarity with marginalized groups and individuals. This was visible, particularly during the COVID-19 pandemic and the devastating earthquakes that struck Turkey and Syria in February 2023. These organizations and unregistered groups served as the first responders, providing essential services, coordinating relief efforts, and offering support to the most marginalized members of society. Yet, despite their invaluable work, their efforts have been hampered due to a lack of sustainable funding and restricted funding schemes, as well as anti-gender attacks. This bears witness to the inadequacies of our current philanthropic models, which often prioritize short-term outcomes over long-term sustainability and fail to provide the flexibility and space needed to address rapidly evolving challenges. So today I'll discuss the vital role of these organizations, the systemic issues within philanthropy, and why feminist funding is essential for effective response to crises and creating lasting change. I will particularly draw on the research findings and recommendation fact sheets of the Resistor project, which explored the gendered inequalities exacerbated by the pandemic in 30 European countries, and co-created solutions to be deployed by policymakers and civil society organizations, which I also contributed as a researcher. I will put the website of the project and relevant fact sheets in the chat after my presentation, and I will also benefit from research and experience of international organizations and feminist funds, including Feminist Fund Turkey. So crises and disasters have a disproportionately negative effect on vulnerable groups. When crises take place in the context of structural inequalities, they escalate into social disasters. In the case of gender plus inequalities, the 3 cycles of the Resistor research has shown that the COVID-19 pandemic crisis has had a devastating impact on women and LGBTQI, wiping out progress in intersectional gender mainstreaming, increasing gender-based violence in general, and digital violence in particular, exacerbating the gender care gaps, particularly as a result of teleworking and distance education, and deepening the gender inequalities in the healthcare sector. According to a report of UN 2022, COVID-19 caused the first increase in poverty rates in decades. Lockdowns introduced at different phases of the pandemic led to job losses and consequent losses of income, accommodation, and financial independence. While deepening existing inequalities, the pandemic also disproportionately affected women and LGBTQI individuals. The 2021 report of International Labour Organization confirmed that women suffered disproportionate job and income losses due to their overrepresentation in the hardest hit sectors. The reduction in women's paid work has also been connected to an increase in their share of unpaid work, exacerbating existing inequalities. However, even though tackling poverty and unemployment was an issue addressed in the majority of national recovery and resilience plans of EU countries, the gender plus dimension of poverty is almost entirely absent. Even prior to the pandemic, women were at a higher risk of poverty, as they tend to be employed in low-income and precarious sectors. And the gender care gap often hinders their participation in the labor market. In the context of the pandemic and earthquakes, civil society organizations emerged as essential actors in crisis management and mitigation, responding more quickly than government authorities, filling the gaps left by the governments, providing support and resources to those most in need, and catering to the distinct needs of women, people of color, the LGBTQI, and other marginalized groups. They provided essential support to vulnerable groups who fell through the cracks of social protection schemes. Particularly feminist and queer organizations, especially those that adopt an intersectional perspective, have played a key role. Despite their effectiveness, CSOs in general, feminist organizations in particular, face a complex set of obstacles, including limited funding, bureaucratic barriers, and gender backlash. 99% of development grants still don't go to women's rights and feminist movements. As Kate Kruger, Executive Director of Urgent Action Fund for Feminist Activism, said, the pandemic further exacerbated these challenges, demonstrating the need for sustainable, long-term, core, and flexible funding to support their work. The stringent requirements and expectations of traditional funding models limit the autonomy and creativity of organizations, unregistered groups, and communities, and it impedes their ability to respond effectively to emerging crises. Too often, funding is tied to specific projects or outcomes, leaving organizations ill-equipped to respond to emerging needs or shifting priorities. This not only undermines the effectiveness of relief efforts, but also perpetuates a cycle of dependency and vulnerability among marginalized communities. Restricted funding drives competition and makes collaboration more challenging, undermining the change we want to see in the world. But the problems within philanthropy run deeper than just restricted funding schemes. Despite the vital role that feminist movements play in advancing social justice and promoting gender equality, they receive only a fraction of philanthropic money. According to recent studies, less than 2% of total philanthropic money goes to feminist causes, while the majority of funding continues to flow to mainstream organizations. This disparity reflects broader power imbalances within philanthropy, where decision-making remains concentrated in the hands of a privileged few, perpetuating existing inequalities and marginalizing voices from historically marginalized communities, and of course, hindering transformative change. So, what needs to change? How can we build a more equitable and inclusive philanthropic ecosystem that centers the needs and experiences of communities and grassroots organizations, that is ready to trust, share, and learn rather than just to give, monitor, and control? The answer lies in feminist funding. As feminist groups are generally underfunded, unrecognized, and also threatened by governments, feminist funding plays a vital role in these highly politicized and restricted spaces. In this sense, feminist funds offer a radical departure from traditional philanthropic models, prioritizing principles of equity, mutual learning, resilience, and solidarity. Unlike traditional donors, feminist funding embraces a participatory grant-making model, which empowers grassroots organizations and communities to shape funding priorities and allocations and drive social change from the ground up. Their flexible funding can provide a dynamic and adaptable solution, placing decision-making power directly in the hands of those working on the ground. Furthermore, by contributing to the sustainability of organizations through covering operational costs, they also allow for effectively planned long-term projects, as well as leaving space for experimentation and creativity. They recognize the need for a continuous rather than episodic support system and relationship building that aligns with community-led initiatives, natural rhythms, and cycles. Feminist funds emerging even in the most politicized and polarized contexts are crucial actors in the drive for gender equality. Also, because of their reach and long-term trust-based relationships with some of the smallest, newly emerging grassroots organizations working daily at the heart of change within communities. Global Fund for Women's analysis of its own data showed that the latest annual budget for almost half of its grant applicants was less than $30,000. And yet, women's rights organizations have been proven time and again to be one of the most effective players in bringing about long-lasting change. Yet these organizations and groups keep facing the good old problem of being expected to have a visible track record and years-long financial reports as eligibility criteria, preventing them even from daring to apply to many grants. However, they are forced to use their creative and activist energies to secure funds and to adapt their plans and projects to fit the ever-changing priorities and predefined solutions of donors, which are often not informed by needs on the ground. Feminist funds play a crucial role in mobilizing resources and distribute funds to grassroots organizations. By adopting a participatory grant-making model, these funds shift the power to grassroots organizations. It is not just about providing financial support to groups, it's about also community building, collaborating, mutual learning, and challenging the structural inequalities that perpetuate poverty, oppression, and exclusion. It is about rethinking ways of distributing resources, wealth, and influence, and moving away from the top-down hierarchical structures that largely characterize our societies today. So there is an urgent need for donors to reassess their philanthropic mindset and grant-making strategies. They need to reflect on what it means to effectively resource feminist movements. This requires redefining the donor-grantee relationship as one of horizontal partnership and embracing flexible funding approaches that prioritize mutual trust, collaboration, and local resilience. This is a call out to donors to integrate in their grant-making strategies more investment in core funding for emerging and grassroots organizing, rather than imposing complicated and cumbersome grant applications that do not even pay operating costs. This requires moving beyond restrictive funding models and supporting feminist funds that work with communities to drive solutions. This requires listening to activists about what is actually needed in their very specific context and building long-term relationships. This also requires acknowledging, learning from, and supporting the multiplicity of resources the communities have, such as skills, knowledge, networks, and activist energy, acknowledging that money is not the only nor the most important resource to foster social change. Shifting power aims to put the decision-making power about what is actually funded and what that looks like into the hands of those who are closest to the issues themselves. Shifting power requires flexibility, courage, and a commitment to learning and openness to mistake. It is about time that donors match talk with actions, fund boldly, and embrace the risk that is necessary for transformative social change. Thank you for your time and attention. I'm looking forward to your reflections and questions.
Thank you, Pınar. All three speakers finished on the spot. Thank you so much for keeping to time. I didn't have to remind you once. It's such a pleasure to be the moderator of such a panel. Pınar, you started off with underlining first how civil society organizations, particularly feminist organizations, often emerge as crucial actors in responding to crises and filling in the gaps left by the state, and how they've been, actually feminist organizations have been primary agents of social change. But nevertheless, they receive, you gave some astounding statistics, such a little segment of overall philanthropic funding. And you introduced the very radical notion of feminist funding characterized by participatory processes, social change from ground up, adaptability and flexibility, allowing for experimentation and creativity, relationship and community building, and mutual learning. And I think your point about how resources do not only mean money, but also knowledge, influence, and skills, and how feminist funding should look out for more equitable distribution of these resources. Thank you for this crucial intervention. Okay, so now we can open the floor for questions and comments. Are there any questions in chat? I think we have some requests for sharing the presentations, which I believe WWHR will do with the participants. Berfu, I think I see your hand up. Yes, please.
Yeah, thank you all very much for these very enriching presentations. It was very informing and thought-provoking, all of your presentations. I have a question to all of you, but it seems more related to Pınar Ensari's intervention. But you know, if you want to reply, you can all respond to this. So we know that anti-gender movements have massive political power and money behind them, and they get more powerful with rising populism and right-wing leaders coming into power. On the other hand, we see that some global north countries are pulling out of feminist foreign policies and defunding feminist organizations. In this situation, how do you see a political transnational intervention can be made? What kind of advocacy or solidarity can we show for other contexts? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Berfu. Do I see any other hands? Okay, if not, I have two questions, then one to Süheyla on whether we really do know what the technical solutions to fighting gendered poverty are. The menu of choices have on the one extreme the imposition of cash transfers and social transfers by the state to women in poverty as a main strategy. Also, by the way, supported by neoliberal institutions, intergovernmental institutions such as the World Bank, where imposition of austerity is okay as long as those who are the most vulnerable receive some social transfers. But that inevitably is based on a vision of dependency of women on the state in a sort of a patriarchal relation. And the other solution, the sort of like complementing solution, the family union based on the conventional gender division of labor, holding that intact as a strategy for poverty. So that's on one hand. And on the other hand is the feminist claim for fighting against gender poverty through not only income poverty, but also time poverty through decent jobs growth and giving women equal access to the ability to have their own earnings, but not in a way that pushes them into time poverty, also complemented by care policies, for example. So what would be your comment on this? And to Pınar Uyan, Pınar, you rightfully mentioned about how so-called natural disasters, you put a question mark on to what extent they're natural, and you mentioned the human factor in turning natural events, natural shocks into full-fledged disasters. And one of the aspects which you didn't necessarily mention has to do with allocation of resources, public funds, to build resilience against these natural occurrences. So for instance, the pandemic uncovered the level of underinvestment in healthcare and also to some extent in elderly care, which was definitely a negative influence on our resilience to respond to the global pandemic. In the case of the earthquake in Turkey, in eastern Turkey, early 2023, that was also a moment where we came to this horrible realization that despite the disasters that natural earthquake was known to be coming, there was hardly any public investment in rebuilding the infrastructure, the social and physical infrastructure, to build resilience against the earthquake. So would you comment on that? And I see another hand by Gülay Günlük. Hi, Gülay.
Hey.
Yes, please.
I hope I
Gülay.
can.
Yes, we can hear.
Yes. Okay. Yeah, I very much thank you for all this, how do I say, horizon opening exchanges. But I only wanted to share my experience, my recent experience, and therefore I wanted to pose some questions to all the speakers. Not all the speakers do not take that in person, but to all the community, because I'm aware that the topic of this or the focus is on poverty, but because of my involvement in a recent project with Jade, I have become, long become concerned about the reduction of feminist approaches to only poverty groups. I do not want to underestimate the importance of it. However, my experience with gender budgeting has also brought me this impression that we do not have, we are concerned about the gender inequality as feminist economists, but we do not have had any voices from any poverty groups today. And we do not have any such voices apart from some micro projects in the past, except that we held a kind of anti-IMF conference or meeting back in 10 years ago, that we did have some voices from there. So this is one point. And the other one, well, this is one point because I'm also much more concerned with you all, not about only the marginalized people, but only, especially in the specific case of Turkey, that we have the existence problem in public space of women of all scales, classes, education, and so on and so on. Now, the second one that I want to share and also ask you for reflections is that I have been recently reviewing the IMF, the World Bank, the Scotland, and the European Union documents on legal documents, which are more and more, I mean, I'm mentioning 23, 24 or further strategies, that they have been emphasizing this gender equality issues, inequality issues, gender in the broader sense, and also the public fund allocations, commitments for these issues. So I'm a bit kind of intrigued because I'm asking to all the speakers, should I take them seriously in my review, or what would be the reservations, including the grant applications and so on? Because I have seen that, or I have heard that there are donors or some, sorry, I might miss the name, but my question is to all of this community to the all participants in this session. Why are we expecting, why are our expectations from the donors? So thank you.
Thank you, Gülay, for that question. And I think we have a somewhat related question in chat from Ezel Sönmez Ocak, who is asking, in gender and intersectional conversation of class reading is often missing. However, populist right-wing movements try to get their political base by empowering populations through neoliberal economic policies, especially women, migrants, ethnic racial minorities. How can feminist movements challenge the neoliberal economic policies and integrate a class conversation within intersectionality conversations? So, a lot of questions. Shall we go in order that we followed for the speakers? So, Pınar, Uyan, can we start with you?
Okay, I mean, I think there are very important points, and I don't know to what extent I can provide an answer, but like maybe going from the very last one and also combining with your question, İpek, due to time limitation, I couldn't explain, I guess, myself very clearly in terms of politics of need interpretation. I actually think that it is very important to have an understanding of different needs and also including care politics, the emphasis on feminist politics to kind of mainstreaming feminist pointings for resettling the agenda. And I think that's very crucial also with respect to what you raised in terms of natural and unnatural disasters, because I think what we need to see is that as the case in earthquake, I mean, the earthquakes actually, the whole, I mean, what had been afterwards done mostly by the women themselves and all the family, I mean, all the things that were on the basic needs and the following steps require definitely a new understanding to be taken into the agenda right now. An important immediate action is needed, not only on those places, but also like in Istanbul case that we're expecting. So I actually think that redesigning or rethinking is crucial, and setting the agenda based on the realities of today's polycrisis and the following crisis in terms of climate and also natural expected disasters. We need to take a feminist perspective in redefining the needs, because all the arguments, I think it's also related to Gülay's question, that this allocation of resources or the limitations of funds will always be on the agenda, but then who will set the agenda? What are those things that we prioritize? Takes back to the all power, sort of who decides to what with these, the sort of the traditional definition, but I just want to underline the importance of redefining the needs and redefining the needs with a much more human-centric perspective. And that's also the reason why I try to underline the importance of capabilities, because I think when we think about in terms of capability sets, which means that they're actually there as a real opportunity for women to, or people, individuals to exercise, we can show sort of not only as a right in general sort of generic sense, but as a real opportunity, then we can reflect on the existing inequalities rather than the sort of general claim that the right is there. So what I would like to sort of say as a last point about this intersectionality and class issue, I actually think that the existing literature, the research that most of the feminist economics and all those feminist social scientists have been doing actually try to reflect this intersectionality and try to show this, how sort of class and also gender and sexual orientation, different sexual orientation, how they're all sort of overlap, and how these sort of overlapping positions create further inequalities. And so when we talk about poverty, lack of time, lack of access to the income and other things, we actually have been, I think, quite successfully show the existing condition. But the importance of today's discussion, I guess, is seeing the realities of actual politics and how these politics sort of create a kind of backlash. Most important question, I guess, something Suela also had tried to underline, from this point, what we need to do, in a way, change the wave when we are the existing media ecosystem, sort of crisis creating fear and uncertainty for every class and every sort of, because deprivation is something different for every class. For middle class, it even creates a further backlash or further fear. So I actually think that today's discussion is very timely. Of course, within this limitation, we cannot provide just one answer, but I believe that one of the key dimension or one of the key steps that we need to further take is based on our existing knowledge of the field, sort of rethinking various ways of practical steps in terms of both sort of existing national or, let's say, country politics, but at the same time, much more global international one. Because I actually think that, especially with respect to migration, refugee, but not only limited to that, there's an enormous need to cooperate, sort of let's say, territories. Much more global dialogue is needed, and different maybe best examples that we can somehow transfer to one to another is needed. I can continue more, but I think I'm taking a lot of time. Sorry, so let me shut.
Thank you, Pınar. Süheyla?
Yeah, so I am going to be short and sweet. Do we have the technical solutions? Actually, we do. We do, because you have a lot of feminist economists thinking about how things should happen, and you have analysis of how you want to bring care, what should a care-centered economy look like, right? Both for macroeconomic policies, like if I think about work of Diane Elson and others, but also including yours, İpek, that you presented at the CSW closed-door meetings, right? But apart from macroeconomy, also at the micro level, in terms of starting from how you ensure credit programs actually build collective strength, or you have the example of SEWA, which works as a great union for informal sector workers. The analysis is there. But the point is, and that's why I was saying this is political, right? It's not, a lot of the time, and this is my experience as engaging with policymakers and arguments. I mean, it's sort of going out of the neoliberal logic in terms of cost and benefit when you say, okay, don't do infrastructure projects, actually providing care support to women would generate more GDP. The thing is that there's a political connection to doing infrastructure projects because it generates rents, it generates business contracts for the ruling elite's friends and family. Care interventions don't. So it's about how do we make those choices politically costly so that they don't make those choices. It's about being savvy about that political campaign and messaging, which is where what Pınar is you touched on in terms of how different solutions look different for different class groups and different intersections. And of course, backlash actors create moral panic. And that moral panic is also around economic security. Oh, the migrants are coming and they'll take over the jobs. Well, migrants are there because there's a demand for their labor. They just don't, like materialize. So it's not just providing evidence that we absolutely need because we need to counter, but it's also that political messaging that hits your heart. We haven't got that right. We either get very technical, that's what I meant, like we get very technical in explaining this is the evidence, this is the fact, where we need to be more effective and hit here. And we haven't got that solution as of yet. So that would be my main thing. And my other appeal is, of course, you have the larger vision. Sometimes it requires smaller steps, right? And immediate steps. So sometimes you will work with solutions that are not going to be perfect. So dreaming is different from when you're actually building coalitions and working towards change. There you will make certain kinds of compromises. It's about, are those compromises well chosen? And does it take you to the next step? Of course, that's not always easy to stomach because we want things to be perfect. But apart from bringing about a revolution that turns everything upside down, and which is also very bloody and costly most of the time, and the system's not perfect, but let's keep chipping at it and pushing wherever we can push.
Thank you, Süheyla. Excellent. And Pınar and Sari.
So I wanted to reflect on Berfu Şeker's question because she specifically mentioned about my presentation. There was this brief moment that I couldn't hear her well, so I'm sorry if I missed anything. I wanted to mention how this discriminatory practices and anti-gender movements work unfortunately well in terms of reducing the already limited resources to feminist and queer groups and activists and organizations. A report, for instance, from the European, I just checked it, a report from the European Union Agency for Fundamental Rights, they highlighted this too, like they highlighted they consulted at least 400 CSOs throughout EU, and they highlighted the discriminatory and restrictive funding practices that exist in a number of EU countries, which is especially a problem for CSOs focusing on gender equality and LGBTQI rights. So you already, like CSOs already, especially small ones, like small scale grassroots ones, already have difficulties accessing resources. But then if they work on advocacy and on gender-based violence, on gendered poverty, then it's even becoming more and more impossible. So in this context, I believe that transnational politics should be like engaging in solidarity with other organizations, communities, activist groups, and feminist funds in other countries, in other localities, to learn from their experiences and strategies and to help amplify their voices. And the organizations and unregistered groups, they are unfortunately forced to operate with a mindset, with a mentality of the scarcity of resources. Although the resources are not scarce, right? And this gets in the way of collaboration. So acts of solidarity and the collective activist attempt to mobilize all the resources out there and to redistribute it and to share it with others is very vital, I believe. In response to Gülay Günlük's question, I'm not sure I heard the last sentence. That was about my presentation, I think. So was it like, what is this expectation from donors? Am I right? I don't want to say unnecessary.
Sorry. Yes, because I mentioned that I have just reviewed the 23-24 reviews of the EU gender strategies and also IMF strategies and UN women's strategies. So I wonder, where do they stand?
Who? Like donors, you mean? Or why are we expecting resources from
They are
them?
the World Bank. They are all donors. UNDP as well.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So maybe I should have made it a little bit more clear in my presentation. That's something we as Feminist Fund Turkey always have in mind, that when we think of philanthropy, we don't only think of institutional donors or these big corporations or UN or EU, World Bank, because we also are aware of their role in sustaining the inequalities and maintaining this hierarchical relationship. So I want to highlight, because because of the limited time, I didn't mention this, but I think I also think that individual donors, not only donating money, but also their skills, expertise, time, networks, it's very vital, especially in this current context and shrinking civic space. I find their role extremely important to break the cycle of dependency and power hierarchy with international institutional funders, to increase the sustainability of grassroots organizations and to foster community building, because they are also part of the community and they can be part of the social change. So, but however, in especially Turkish context, it is so difficult to build a lasting donor base and to fundraise in that regard because of this law on collection of aid. It's just sustaining government's power over fundraising and feminist activist work, and by accumulating resources on established and mainstream CSOs. So when I say shift the power, I believe that it's also the role, it's also the responsibility of individual donors to shift that power. that was my response.
Okay, thank you, Pınar. I like what you said about how that mindset of scarcity of resources is unfounded to begin with, that actually resources are plentiful, but it's a matter of how they are distributed and the processes through which that distribution occurs. That's a challenge to neoclassical, to neoliberal economics at its own basis. We are almost 10 minutes over our time, but just as a last question, is there anybody else who would like to comment or pose a question from the floor? By the way, we do have Turkish-English translation, so the questions can also be posed in Turkish. Türkçe'de soru alabiliriz ya da yorum alabiliriz katılımcılardan. Okay, I don't think we have any more questions. So thank you all for, first of all, thank you to our wonderful speakers for their thought-provoking presentations, for their time and mental labor. And thank you to all the participants for being here and for some insightful questions and a lively discussion. And thank you, Berfu Şeker and Ezel Sönmez Ocak from Women for Women's Human Rights for taking the initiative on organizing this parallel event. It was a joy to be able to moderate it. Okay, so thank you all and hope to see you in other events.